Us very nicely to our next discussion here on this African Morning. So we all have until tomorrow to comment on those draft regulations that Tumza was just talking about. It all pertains to the coronavirus response in the country. Well, we know that the minister announcing yesterday these proposed regulations, they've been gazetted. These changes could edge us towards officially ending the state of disaster. Well, that's why we asked you those questions. Do you think it's a good idea? Too soon? You don't really care? That's where you get to go and vote. Now, I remind you, we've been in this state of disaster since March 2020. It's been 2 years already. Professor Benjamin Smart is heading up the Future of Health and Medicines project at an organization, I love the name, the Institute for the Future of Knowledge. I'd love to have that on my business card. Prof, good morning to you. Thanks very much for your time, Prof Smart. So if I had to give you, before we unpack some of the regulations, I'm giving you 4 options. These are on our website, Prof. Do you think this is A, a good move? It's too soon is option B. Option 3, some restrictions should remain. And option 4, I'm not bothered either way. How would Professor Smart vote on our website?
I would go with option 1. I think it's a good thing, perhaps combined a little bit with option 3, because some restrictions are remaining. So I think governments are really on the right track. There are a few restrictions still in place. But fortunately, they're no longer relying, or at least as from the 5th of April or whatever date is finalized, these will no longer rely on us being in a state of disaster.
So what does it actually look like when we move back out of a state of disaster, yet some regulations stay in place? Just to help me understand, it's still early in the morning, only 2 cups of coffee. How can we be not in a state of disaster, but still have some regulations?
Well, a lot of the current regulations can continue outside of a state of disaster within existing legislation. Things that would not be able to continue or at least be re-implemented would be things like restrictions on movements, curfews, these kind of regulations that really require a state of disaster, things that are unconstitutional outside of a state of disaster. But for the time being, I think we're going to remain using masks indoors for a short while at least. But ultimately, I think the president has taken on board the sort of widespread criticism that came from public health professionals over the last few weeks when the continued state of disaster was announced. And appreciated the importance of moving away from this. I mean, really, I don't see any reason why the state of disaster needs to continue. Tuberculosis and various other health issues that we have in South Africa currently causing significantly more harm than COVID-19 is. And we really need to move back to a state of normalcy where there's parliamentary oversight over these kind of regulations.
And this is the question, Professor Smart, that so many people were asking, is originally, at its very base level, I understand there were multiple ramifications around a state of disaster, but at its base reasoning, it was to get our health system ready for COVID-19. And the critics, which it seems were right in this case because we're coming out of it, were saying that if 2 years later, Prof, we still didn't have our health system ready for a virus, we were never going to get it done. There must have been a line in the sand which had to be drawn. Would you agree with that, that if we're not ready by now, there isn't much else we could do?
I think that's right to some extent. There were really twofold, I think. One is to prepare the health system. You'll remember we were building hospitals and trying to get vaccines and so on and so forth. The other thing was to flatten the curve. You know, at the time in March 2020, we really didn't know how the infection curve was going to develop. We really didn't know how many people were going to get COVID-19 and how fast, and how many of these people would end up requiring hospitalization. So the precautionary principle played a role. That is to say, look, if you don't really know what's going to happen, you need to be prepared and you need to try and slow the rate of infection so that the hospitals can deal with the number of patients coming in. Now, in the first and second and third waves, to some extent, the hospitals struggled. But with the Omicron variants, now that we're roughly 50% vaccinated and many of the unvaccinated people have had one or another of the COVID variants anyway, we have a certain level of protection. And so the number of hospitalizations has been substantially lower, and hospitals have been able to cope regardless. So as you suggest, the hospitals are now able to deal with the situation, and as a result, the kind of motivations behind the national state of disaster no longer apply.
Yeah. Prof, I'll leave this as my last question to you. I'm going to ask you to put on the hat of the title that you wear as the head of the Future of Health and Medicine project. So, now that we're getting to the end of the state of disaster, we've just heard 0.3% of Pfizer vaccines are going to expire. We're going to have to throw those away. As we get into the end of the state of disaster, do you foresee as well that the vaccination rate is going to drop significantly as well? Because people are going to go, well, there's no need now. We're not in a state of disaster, and most of us have probably had COVID at some point. We're going to end up wasting millions of vaccines. Would you agree with me?
I do agree with you. I agree with you because I think there's a huge vaccine hesitancy issue in South Africa. And I think the majority of people who intend to get the vaccine have already had it. And that's why I think the rate of vaccinations will drop off. There are some people that have been unable to take the vaccine because of where they live and access issues. I think that is less common. I think vaccine hesitancy is a bigger problem than that. And hopefully we can get our vaccination levels up a little bit by making those vaccines available and to the people living in the rural areas that are struggling to get hold of it. But I think the major issue is vaccine hesitancy, and I think that from my experience anyway, vaccine hesitant people are quite difficult to persuade without a vaccine mandate. So I know Professor Karim has been calling for a vaccine mandate. I'm not sure I agree with Professor Karim, but I do agree that this is probably the only way to significantly increase our rate of vaccinations from now on.
Why do you not agree with Professor Karim? Prof, forgive me for jumping in. I'm curious, why do you not agree with Professor Karim before I let you go?
Oh, simply because I believe in bodily integrity to some extent, and although a vaccine mandate would benefit the country, I think it's a last resort and only for a very, very serious virus that's probably doing more harm than this.
I appreciate your time, Prof. I'm sure we'll speak again. It's a title of an organization. I just love the Institute for the Future of Knowledge. Really appreciate Professor Benjamin Smart. He is head of the Future of Health and Medicine project at the Institute for the Future of Knowledge. As we head